Do you ever make the same mistake twice? I should probably rephrase that. Some of you snicker. I guess the question really is, how often do you make the same mistake twice? There seems to be a propensity in human life, which is our human nature, for us to have to learn the same exact lessons over and over again. Now, we're intelligent, I believe, and for the most part, we recognize that when something is bad or something that we do has a bad consequence, that we don't do it again. In childhood, you learn that lesson many times over. Do you know why your children don't want to eat vegetables? They learned their lesson. It didn't taste good, and so they don't want to have to eat them again. It's the reason that my son, Micah, is careful near stairs. When he was 6 months old, he went head first. He surfed right down the steps and scared him. But from that moment on, he learned his lesson, and he's very careful near stairs. It's the reason that we don't touch things that are hot. It's the reason that we look both ways when we cross the street. It's because we learn our lessons. We learn that when we do something that is bad and it has bad consequences, we try not to do that again. The problem in many cases is in the spiritual realm. We do not learn our lesson to do things differently after God has corrected us. And this is exactly where we come to in the story of Jeremiah. And if you've heard any of the messages, I believe we're in our 17th or 16th message. If you've heard any of the messages that we've preached up through this point, you've seen that God in his judgment upon his people was very severe. It was very visible. It could not have been questioned. There could not have been a single person in the land of Israel during that time that should have wondered, why did this destruction come? Why is this city destroyed? Why are the people killed and others taken away to slavery? Why is my family dead? No one should have questioned why this had come. We're going to attempt to move through 5 chapters tonight. In order to gain the whole picture, we'll move very quickly through the first 2 of these chapters. But the first chapter we're going to look at here, Jeremiah chapter number 40, really sets the background of the events immediately following the destruction of Jerusalem. And again, that happened in 586 BC. And I want you to try during this message as much as you can, and I know it's difficult. We're 2,500 years removed from these events. And so I understand it's a different people, it's a different culture, but human nature is exactly the same. The propensity that these people had to forget God's correction is the same propensity or the same draw that we have to forget God's correction in our hearts and our lives. So do what you can to put yourself in their shoes. If you look at Jeremiah chapter number 40, look at verse number 2. It's interesting in this passage that even an unsaved pagan general could note the hand of God against his people and their sins. It says in verse 2, "And the captain of the guard took Jeremiah and said unto him, The Lord thy God hath pronounced this evil upon this place. Now the Lord hath brought it, and done according as he hath said, because ye have sinned against the Lord, and have not obeyed his voice. Therefore this thing is come upon you." This man is the captain, or the man who was the general of the army of Babylon. He was not a saved man. He did not grow up in a believing home, and yet he could very clearly look and see, God did this to you. God is the one, because you have forsaken him, because of your sins, God has levied this judgment against you. It's at this point in the story that Jeremiah is given his freedom. He can basically do whatever he wants. And this is very different from the other people. The others of Jerusalem were told, you're either coming to Babylon with us or you will stay. And they didn't have a choice in the matter. It was not a democracy. They could not say, well, I'm going to vote about that. They either went if they were told or they stayed if they were told. Jeremiah is given an option. And in verse number 4, you see it. The captain of the guard, the general, says, "And now," in verse 4, "Behold, I loose thee this day from the chains which were upon thine hand. If it seem good unto thee to come with me into Babylon, come, and I will look well unto thee," or I'll take care of you. "But if it seem ill, or if it doesn't seem good to come unto thee, to come with me into Babylon, forbear." So don't. "Behold, all the land is before thee. Whither it seemeth good and convenient for thee to go, thither go." And so Jeremiah can either go with the army and enjoy the protection of the general and of the king, or he could stay. Certainly, some people had been able to get out of Jerusalem. You remember, Jerusalem had been sieged. It had been encamped around by the armies of the Babylonians. And Jeremiah, while that siege was taking place, constantly told the people, give yourselves up. Give yourselves over to the Babylonians. Everything will be fine if you give yourselves up. So certainly they had heard about Jeremiah's message, and they reward him and are grateful for what he had been preaching. But in verse 6 of Jeremiah 40, Jeremiah chooses to stay. You see it says there, then went Jeremiah unto Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, to Mizpah, and dwelt with him among the people that were left in the land. And this chapter and these chapters, as we just get a little bit of the background, there's going to be a couple of names, and just want to be able to help you a little bit, and we'll be showing some maps also later. But just so that things are clear and that you don't get confused, I'm going to put a couple names up here on the overhead here on the PowerPoint. Gedaliah is the governor. He is not the king. Oftentimes what happened during this period of time, the king of Babylon would be gaining strength, and he would come in and establish a king, and then the king of Egypt would gain some strength, and he'd come up and he'd establish a king, and they'd just kind of switch kings every now and again. But at this point, and from this point on, there are no more kings. It's simply a governor, someone that's just placed in authority, but he has to give an account to the king of Babylon. And so he's placed in authority as the governor. That's Gedaliah. So G and G, that should help remember. And then you have Ishmael, and the only way to describe him is he's just a bad guy. He's just a bad dude from the moment he steps on the scene. And he comes on the scene in verse number 8. You see it says there, then they came to Gedaliah to Mizpah, even Ishmael, and describes what he does. Now, by the end of the chapter, we have another fellow who comes on the scene, and his name is Johanan. And Johanan warns Gedaliah, the governor, in chapter number 40, and he warns him that Ishmael, this bad guy, is going to try to assassinate him. And Johanan even says, why don't you let me, in verse 15, why don't you let me kill Ishmael? He's going to try to kill you, so why don't you take care of him before he kills you? And at the end, in verse number 16, Gedaliah says no, and he says at the end of the verse, thou shalt not do this thing, for thou speakest falsely of Ishmael. And lo and behold, in chapter 41, verses 1 and 2, we have the story of Ishmael assassinating Gedaliah. And so Gedaliah eventually dies. He is assassinated. After that, in chapter 41, and again, this is a lot of information, but we're getting the background for what God is trying to show in this story. In chapter number 41, Ishmael takes all the people who are being cared for by Gedaliah, and he seeks to go over to the Ammonites. And you see this map of Israel, and up there you see Mizpah. That's where the city of Mizpah is. It's just above Jerusalem. And so Ishmael, after he has killed Gedaliah, he takes everybody that Gedaliah was caring for, that were under the protection of the governor, and he begins to move them and to take them to the land of the Ammonites. In chapter 41 here, in verse 11 and 12, Johanan hears of this. He meets up with Ishmael. They fight, and Ishmael flees. And all the people that were at Mizpah with Gedaliah, all the remnant or all the people who are left in Jerusalem that had gone up to Mizpah, all the people now are returned, but instead of returning to Mizpah, they return to Bethlehem. And it's very clear that you see Bethlehem is just about 6 miles south of Jerusalem, whereas Mizpah is a number of miles north. And the reason they did that was for this reason. The Babylonians were over to my right. If you can see the map of Israel and you see that big body of water, that's the Dead Sea. If you keep going over to the east, that's where the Babylonians are. And if the Babylonians were to come, here's my pointer, they would be coming down through here. That's really the only way to get there, because over on this side, you have a big desert, just a huge desert, and there's no way to traverse and to get across. And so if the Babylonians came and they come down, they would come down here first, and then they'd have to go even farther down into Bethlehem if they wanted to get to the people. And so the people find themselves near or around Bethlehem, and the reason was because they were fearful of the Babylonians. I mean, it makes sense, right? Ishmael had killed the guy that the Babylonians had put into authority and in place. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to be closer to Egypt in case they needed to flee, in case they needed to get away. And this is just, let me get that. That's just an up-close view of where Mizpah, Jerusalem, and then Bethlehem are. All right, so now we come